Welcome everyone who's viewing on YouTube and Facebook and everywhere. I'm happy to introduce a friend of mine. This is Dr. Robert Chao-Romero. He is a pastor, an attorney, a professor at UCLA teaching in Chicano studies and also Asian American studies. Happy to have him here with us to give a little bit of his own story and perspectives on this moment that we're living through. My name is Jeff Liou, and I'm one of the co-authors of the statement from the Asian American Christian Collaborative, and happy to be talking with my friend Robert. Robert, would you tell us a little bit more about yourself? Tell us what you're up to these days, tell us who you are, and then I have a few questions for you.
Yeah, sure. So I'm an Asian Latino. My mom is an immigrant from Hubei province. My dad is an immigrant from Chihuahua, Mexico. And they met here in LA in the early 1960s. And I was born in East Los Angeles and raised in Hacienda Heights. I never thought that I would become a professor. I was on the track to being I thought, just a rich corporate lawyer, making a lot of money and that kind of thing, American dream. And in law school at Berkeley, that's when God got a hold of my life in a really radical way, turned my whole life upside down. And I eventually, through a deep process of soul searching, felt a calling to become a professor and to use that platform as professor to address issues of race and Christianity. And here I am. I've been a professor for about 15 years at UCLA, working in issues of, again, Asian American studies and Latino studies, as well as being a pastor among activists and a community organizer.
Great. I'm thankful for your work, and it's been an honor to kind of be watching it unfold over the last few years. And I follow you on Facebook. So one of the things I became aware of in the last few hours, that an incident unfolded in one of your classes at UCLA. Sounds really disturbing, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to tell us what happened and kind of set the scene for us and help us to get to know the kinds of things that are unfortunately unfolding in this time. So what happened at UCLA?
It's terrible. Yeah, I'm still kind of reeling and getting over it. So yesterday morning was the start of the fall quarter at UCLA, and of course it's all on Zoom and digital because of the coronavirus. And so in my first lecture at 8 o'clock in the morning was a class called Mestizaje, and it's a ethnic studies class about the diversity of race in Mexico. So we look at like Asians in Latin America, the African presence in Mexico, as well as the traditional groups, European and indigenous groups that have formed the Latin American community. And I logged on to my class of 100 students, and almost instantly, a group of about 10 people jumped on the screen and started chanting the N-word with glee. They were just like gleefully chanting the N-word, the N-word, the N-word, monkey, 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 the N-word, the N-word, the N-word. They appeared to be students themselves, so I don't know, if they were UCLA students or what. They had pseudonyms, and they just wouldn't stop. It wasn't like they just did it for 10 seconds or 1 minute. They didn't stop until I eventually had to just cancel the whole thing, the whole Zoom session to make it end. And that was just so traumatizing for myself, but most importantly, it was just traumatic for our students. I mean, they were just distraught. And the students in the class are diverse, Asian American, Latino, African American, and it revealed to me kind of how we are in a tough moment here, in society right now, and that unfortunately it's bringing out the worst in people.
Robert, I'm so sorry that happened. It sounds incredibly disturbing, and I'm especially sorry to the students that had to experience that. I don't know if you have any of these details, but are there steps that the university is taking? Are there things that are unfolding because of that? Any update on the story?
Sure. Yeah. So thankfully, UCLA administration has responded forcefully, very appropriately. And the chancellor sent out an email yesterday saying that they're on it. They've even recruited law enforcement to track these folks down. And they're very committed to making sure this doesn't happen again and making sure that this is a safe space for students.
Okay, well, to our audience, I suppose if you use Zoom, this is a good opportunity for all of us to make sure our settings are set in the ways that are recommended to those of us who use Zoom, so we can do whatever we can to prevent the kind of Zoom bombing that's taking place across the country. And I don't know what all we can do, but it's
passwords is key.
Okay.
That's like the main thing, I think.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Robert. I'm so sorry that happened. I think you're right. This is an indicator of what's going on more broadly, right? That there are folks that are looking to make their way into spaces where conversations on race are happening, including in the academy. So from your perspective as a pastor, lawyer, educator, can you give us some idea of what you see as happening in the broader moment in American society? Yeah. What do you see emerging, or where do you see it coming from, or what's your perspective on all this?
Sure. I think that you have in American society deeply rooted social identities that are there. You know, the US is very diverse and there's a lot of social identities, but there is one type of social identity out there that views the definition of what it means to be American in a very limited way. And is largely racially circumscribed. And I'm not talking about, like, I think there's a range of this, right? But I think that in this moment when things are hard, these deeply ensconced social identities, I think, come to the surface in different ways. And one way in which it comes out is sort of through a social identity that says, that to be American is largely to be white, and that therefore, if there is some type of foreign threat through something like a coronavirus or something along those lines, then that social identity makes it easy to draw upon anti-Asian racism as an example. And I think, of course, this is a spectrum, and I'm not saying that everyone or that most Americans are racist or something, but there is this anti-Asian sentiment that is deeply embedded, and that's, you know, as an Asian American historian, you know, this goes back to the, you know, all the Chinese exclusion laws and the laws that barred all Asians, right, from the U.S. from the late 19th century, early 20th century until 1965, and we tend to, many of us can. I can speak for myself. It's easy for me to forget that because we're lifted up oftentimes as sort of like a model minority kind of a thing, and it's comfortable to sort of say, okay, well, no one's picking on me. I feel bad about what's happening, but I'm gonna kind of just play it safe. But in this moment, unfortunately, this ugly moment that anti-Asian racism is surfacing, and it reminds us of our racial predicament, I think.
Yeah, so I resonate with that. So this is not a new thing. This is an older thing, our racial predicament. It's embedded in the narratives that our country has lived in and inhabited for a long time. One of the ideas that I was encouraged to think about, and I'd love to hear you speak about this as an historian, was that not only do we deal with this history of oppression, but we also, as Asian Americans, have a history of resistance to oppression. I'm wondering if you can maybe narrate a few examples of ways that Asian Americans in the United States have worked against the kinds of oppressions that we've been dealing with for decades, centuries.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, from the very appearance of anti-Chinese laws in the late 19th century, you had Chinese community organizations that fought cases all the way up to the US Supreme Court, right? The anti-Chinese laws in San Francisco, and then you have the laws challenging Japanese internment. And so there's this long history, I think, of you know, we haven't just sat back. Another piece of the puzzle that's interesting to me is sort of the role of Christianity as a source of spiritual capital for the Asian American community in the United States. And there's this concept in critical race theory called community cultural wealth, CCW. And community cultural wealth simply means that every ethnic group has its own sort of cultural treasure, if you will, right? Cultural value, that it's not just sort of dominant Anglo-American culture that has value, but the Asian American, you know, cultural community has its unique value, the Latino community, the African American community, and that we should draw upon that cultural wealth in our social practices, in our community, everything. And spiritual capital is one aspect of community cultural wealth. And that spiritual capital has been present in the Asian American struggle for social justice over the years as well. So I think of, for example, Gordon Hirabayashi, who is the relative of my colleague, one of my colleagues in Asian American studies at UCLA. And Gordon Hirabayashi challenged Japanese internment all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And he did it as a Quaker, right? Drawing from his faith in Jesus and the Quaker tradition of nonviolent resistance. I think of Kagawa from Japan as well, like, you know, about 100 years ago, living in the slums, casting out demons in the slums of Japan, you know, giving up his social privilege, developing business cooperatives, right? Flowing from his central Christian identity. And you know, we can give other examples, but this, I think, spiritual capital has played an important role in Asian American struggles for social justice over the years. I'll just give one quick personal example. So the Chao family, my Chao family, my grandfather and grandmother were some of the founders of InterVarsity in China, or IFES, in the 1930s. And there were big revivals, and it's really amazing. But they were persecuted for their faith when the communist government took over. My grandfather, along with Watchman Nee and a couple of others, they were called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and they were targeted to be killed by the new government. So they fled as religious refugees to Hong Kong and Singapore. And when they were in Hong Kong, they were refugees themselves, right? But my grandmother ministered to refugees, right, in Hong Kong as a refugee, right? And I just think of her great faith that, you know, I am the beneficiary of it. So I think that's another example of what we mean when we talk about the spiritual capital.
Wow, helpful concept from CRT. Dr. Romero, if somebody wanted to go read a little bit more about either spiritual capital or community cultural wealth, do you have a quick recommendation where they could turn?
Sure. So Tara Yosso, Yosso, she invented the concept of community cultural wealth together with my other colleague, Danny Solorzano. So you can look at Tara Yosso, Danny Solorzano. And this notion of spiritual capital within CRT was developed by Lindsay Perez Huber, who's another education scholar. She looked at the qualities that allowed undocumented students to persist in their university education. And she sort of found that faith was one of these core aspects, and she sort of framed that as spiritual capital. And of course, this is just an analog for the concept of religious capital, right, in sociology. You know, it's been around for a long time. I will say, and my own work also looks at that. I have an article in Christianity Next, the Christianity Next journal, which is an Asian American Christian journal founded by Young Lee Hertig. You know, also a prime example of what it means to lead in social justice through spiritual capital. And I have an article there about which presents a kind of a nascent framework for critical race theory in Christianity. So you can check that out too.
Yeah, great, thank you. Everything you're talking about so far, it has as you may know, we have a very broad range of people who've signed the statement. And the ways that people, especially Asian Americans in the past, have been participating in resisting oppression makes me want to ask, how can people in this day and age, maybe people who've signed the document across the spectrum of either Christian belief and expression or industries or sectors of public life, how are some ways that people can be involved in working against anti-Asian racism that you see from your vantage point?
Sure. Well, first of all, it brings me really a lot of joy to see like the broad network that's come together around this topic. And that's why I really, first of all, I'll say like, as much as I'm a community organizer, I'm still more of a pastor, right? As much as I am an activist, my primary spiritual gift is actually evangelism, right? So from those different lenses, and this is where I've learned from, the class that you teach at Fuller on Dr. King, it's like the goal of social justice is not social justice as the final end goal. The goal of social justice is the beloved community, right? The beloved community, which comprises all people, right? And as well as comprises all Asian Americans of different political backgrounds as well, right? So I look at that through that lens. So I think through that lens, it provides a broad framework where we can say, okay, for this particular group, the Asian American Collaborative, we are followers of Jesus, right? Across the political spectrum, and we are united around this idea that anti-Asian racism is wrong, it's evil. And let's leverage our spiritual capital that we all bring in different forms and expressions to challenge this. So we can challenge this in lots of different ways, but I think from that broad framework, that's I think a starting point that can bring us together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I certainly hope that that's the case. That's definitely one of the driving, motivating factors behind the statement, and then all the effort that we're pouring into this. Robert, is there anything that you would say to your fellow academics in terms of how they can be contributing to work against anti-Asian racism at this time?
Yeah, so I'm so blessed that like my colleagues in Asian American Studies at UCLA are amazing. They are, from before day one, have been involved, right, in the struggle against anti-Asian racism. And so the problems that have emerged lately, I mean, they're at the front lines of that. So I'm so grateful, and I learned so much from them. And I think that like one thing that the religious community can bring into this conversation is sort of the way in which congregations can serve as a conduit for community development, community organizing, and so on and so forth, right? Like I think of like Bill Watanabe, and the Little Tokyo Center, mm-hmm. building around those types of networks that have been around for like decades. I think that can be something unique that can be brought in from the Asian American faith community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Asian American networks that pre-exist as conduits for the work that scholars in ethnic studies are wanting to do. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Another thing that comes to my mind is like, I think of how there's an analog here between the Latino Christian community and the Asian American community, mm-hmm. in the sense that as much as there's a fierce history of Latina Christian social justice activism, the fact of the matter is that most Latina Christians in this present moment historically have not been engaged in social justice struggles, right? Mm. But that being said, the last 3 years with all the anti-immigrant stuff that's happened has mobilized so many people, so many Latino Christians that have never previously gotten involved, right? So I think of like the case with Pastor Noya, so the Matthew 25 movement and many other orgs. We were fortunate to stand with Pastor Noé Carillas, who was a Pentecostal Latino pastor who was married to a U.S. citizen wife, had 2 U.S. citizen kids, and he was threatened to be unjustly deported, right? And that was really a wake-up call for many in the Latino community. And so you had his case, for example, it motivated thousands of Latino Pentecostal Christians to get involved, right? Who for the first time called their legislators, for the first time they did prayer vigils in front of immigration headquarters. They did fundraisers to support the Carillas family because their main breadwinner was in detention. And anyways, it was a galvanizing moment. And I think that this is also a galvanizing moment for Asian American Christians. I hope that it will be. And from what I can tell, there is a good possibility of that. And what that will look like, to be honest, I don't exactly know. Right? But as in the Pastor Noah case, though, it makes me hopeful that kind of thing could happen.
Yeah, and Robert, I know that you're drawing some parallels here between the Latina community and the Asian American community. I also know that you're working on a concept that you've called the Brown Church. So what kind of parallels do you see? What do you mean by Brown Church? And what might be the positioning for Asian Americans in the project that you're working on?
For sure, yeah. So thank you. So sorry for the selfless plug, but I have a book coming out next month with InterVarsity Press Academic called Brown Church. And it looks, in broad strokes, it looks at the history of Latina Christian social justice movements and argues that the Latino community cannot be understood without an exploration of the role of Christian faith, right? Both Catholic and Protestant, Pentecostal, in challenging social injustices, right? It's a big picture kind of look at that. But what I mean, like by Brown is more of a metaphor. Some Latinos like myself, like I'm actually literally brown, right? But as Latinos, we come in all different hair colors and eye colors and everything. And I mean, there's Asian Latinos, there's, African descent Latinos, there's Jewish descent Latinos. I mean, we're everything, right? So, but Brown is more of a metaphor for racial liminality. Brown, in the way I'm using it, is a metaphor for racial in-betweenness, right? And how Latinos in the U.S. have historically been in between white and black in the racial discourse and legal frameworks, right? Enjoying some of the privileges sometimes of whiteness. So like in the time of Jim Crow, for example, some Latinos got a pass and got legally categorized as white, right? And enjoyed some of that privilege. They still, got discriminated against, right? And at the same time, most Latinos did not benefit from sort of that privilege of whiteness, but nonetheless, we were sort of in between from a legal perspective, from a social perspective, right? And from that in-betweenness, we followed Jesus, right? And we did church, right? And we struggled against segregation. We struggled against anti-immigrant sentiment, and we continue to do that. But there's this long history of that, right? And the book looks at, well, from that space of in-betweenness, how have Latinos done church? And for that matter, I'll just say Jesus was brown in that sense as well. Right? Jesus was in between, right? So Jesus was from Galilee, right? Like the hood of his day, right? People in Galilee, they spoke with an accent. Many of them were looked down upon because they weren't from like the center of power in Jerusalem, right? They were kind of like Galilee was like it was like the hood, or think about the most rural part of the United States, right? Some rural part of Iowa, that was Galilee too, right? And when God came in human flesh, right, to bear our sins and to transform the world, he chose to be a Galilean, right? Galilee was also nestled in between sort of different cultural influences, Greek, Roman, Jewish influences, right? And so Jesus came from this in-between space as well, right? As well as all of, as you know, I feel weird telling you this because you're the expert here, Jeff, but all his, the early followers, his earliest followers and leaders, right? They came from this in-between space, right? And changed the world. Now, with that framework of brownness in place, my Asian American side of me is also brown, right? And Asian Americans in the U.S. have also been metaphorically brown, if you will. Some of us actually are even literally brown as well, but the metaphor still applies, right? So during the time of the anti-Asian exclusion laws, we certainly weren't white, but yet we weren't black. And it's interesting, it was like historically, 100 years ago, Latinos were actually more white than Asian Americans, right? Like Asian Americans were viewed as very kind of working class, immigrants, the bearers of all things bad in the United States 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. And Latinos actually got more of a whiteness pass 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. In the last 40 years or so, it's kind of reversed, right? Largely. And Latinos have been flipped, and many of us are considered more kind of working class, immigrant, mm-hmm. Galileans, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. And the more educated Asian American immigrants, although of course there's great diversity there, and there's many Asian Americans who live in poverty as well. But that being said, the social stereotype is sort of this model minority myth thing, right? And I have observed, unfortunately, that like just as Latinos 100 years ago, some said, okay, I'm just going to sort of lay back, enjoy my privilege. I'm not going to side with the Asian Americans who are being mistreated. Over the last, several decades, that's been a common Asian American posture as well. I hate to say it, right? But mm-hmm. You can remember, even though I don't look like it too much, I'm half Chinese, so to speak from my Chinese side. And I think that this moment is changing that, right? Where we're like, oh my gosh, we can't just sit back and like let our fathers and our mothers and our grandparents and our get slashed in the face, right? And being yelled racial epithets and like mm-hmm. experiencing verbal and physical abuse. So mm-hmm. it's a moment of reflection.
Yeah. I mean, at the very least, one of the things I hear you saying is that for all of us who fit that category of in-betweenness or liminality, that we have an opportunity to support each other and stand with each other, almost in the, that we're not supposed to forget our oppression in Egypt, right? Israel is instructed to not forget that you too were oppressed in Egypt. You came out of Egypt. So right. All those folks who experienced the kind of in-betweenness and the dynamics of being caught in between, neither here nor there, we could work together. This is an opportunity for us to resonate in that way. So that's super helpful. I guess I just have one last question for you, which is, I think, a question that's being asked of a lot of folks is, when you saw the statement come out, what made you decide to sign it?
Sure, the statement represents what I believe in, what I'm about, right? And I think that like I'm in I'm very in between in a lot of ways, but I'm in between in the sense of like I'm an activist, but I'm also like my faith is very orthodox. Right? My view of Jesus and my view of sort of the way that Scripture sort of gives me direction in life, and so it's like it's both. It's like so as much as I'm an activist, I'm also sort of I can't separate my activism from my faith in Jesus, right? And I don't fit easily in left or right political categories, to be honest, right? Mm-hmm. Nor do I fit, whether those left-right categories are political or theological, I don't fit easily in there, right? And so I know that can probably be uncomfortable for myself or others to always feel in between. Mm-hmm. But I think the statement offers a broad net, a broad tent, where though we can disagree on some things very passionately, which is fine, right? We can still come together. Mm-hmm. And so if it's Jesus and justice and race, then, I'm most likely going to sign it.
Yeah. Thanks. That's super helpful to me. I feel that liminality in my own way. And so I'm really grateful for the scholarly work that you're doing and the activist and the pastoral work that you're doing. And Dr. Robert Chao-Romero, thank you for spending time with us and speaking to our audience and to us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jeff.